How can we make the world better? By making ourselves better. The Dr. Joe Show explores how you can make positive personal change by using his groundbreaking and highly effective I Am approach to understand who we are and why we do what we do. Your small changes can have big effects.
Join us now for the Dr. Joe Show with Mark Stiles of Stiles Law, Thomas McCoy, and your host, Dr. Joe Schrand.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Dr. Joe Show. Very nice, Mark. Very, very nice. So, how's the week been for you?
Amazing.
Yeah?
Epic. Yeah, oh yeah.
It's an epic week? Why?
It's been an amazing week because I got a little closer to heaven this week.
How is that?
I got up into the mountains.
I'm so delighted to have our next guest here on the Dr. Joe Show. Tom, can you introduce our guest, please?
She was an academic psychologist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School for more than 23 years. She's a graduate of Brown University and author of The Anatomy of Grief. Welcome, Dorothy Holinger.
Welcome,
hello.
Dorothy.
Hello, Joe. Hello, Tom. Hello, Mark.
Hello. So, you know, we got a chance to talk a little bit about grief in another show during COVID, but I'm fascinated by this, The Anatomy of Grief. Can you tell us about the book? How did you come up with the title, The Anatomy of Grief?
What will I start with first? The anatomy, well, obviously people know what grief is, but why we called it anatomy is I talk about the structure of grief throughout the book in very many different ways. And what it's about what happens to the human self. And what I mean by when grief comes into your life, when you lose a loved one. And what I mean by that is the brain gets grief-stricken. You can't think clearly. It's hard to remember things. The heart is hurting. The metaphorical heart, people will say, I have a hole in my heart. My heart hurts. Also biologically, I mean, there's something that actually can happen. It's very rare, but it's called broken heart syndrome, which is also called, the formal name, the medical name is Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. And the third part of this is how the body hurts. The body just, yearns for the loved one. And this is grief. And grief is also, if you would look at how you could define it, well, simply put, it's the intense sorrow that we feel after a loved one dies. But broadly put, if you think about it, Darwin said grief is universal. And it is. It cuts across species. And it's also timeless. It can go back, I talk about this in the book. I write about it. Can go back millions and millions of years. And there's an unpredictability to grief. Let me back up just a minute. This happens to everyone at some point of their life. And one doesn't know how long it's going to last. It has its own timetable for everyone, actually. And grief belongs to the griever. No one can tell the bereaved, it's about time. Don't you think it's about time that you just moved on? That's just not fair, and it's not appropriate. The griever owns their own grief. And another part of this is that grief, which is a crisis, actually, when somebody dies, this can create growth. This can help with a transformation. All of us change. And in the depth of all this sorrow, there can be great change. And, if you think about hardship or something difficult, just think about learning a subject. You've got a new textbook, a new course you're into, and looks awful. How can I do this? But you do, and what you're learning is how to tolerate discomfort. And think of somebody who's a runner or a tennis player. I mean, they don't say, I'm not going to do this because it hurts too much. Well, it's the same in some ways for grief. To be able to endure it, to experience it, to allow it, that's what helps it quiet. And it does quiet eventually. But part of its unpredictability is that it can erupt at any time. Amazingly, for example, I tell the example of somebody going to a movie and seeing one of the actors. It kind of reminds her or him of the father that has died, and well, I'll make it the woman. And she comes outside, and all of a sudden, she simply bursts into tears, and not knowing where did this come from, but sitting down and realizing that, oh, that man really reminded me of my father. And you know what? It's going to be the anniversary of his death next week. And of course, I'm more sensitive to it. So this is part of what grief is. And another characteristic of it is it depends on the relationship the bereaved had with the loved one. And it also depends on the bereaved, what their attachment history was. Was it a secure attachment? Were they able to tolerate separations, absences from their mom or the caretaker? That all contributes to what kind of grief someone can feel. And this can segue into what I'd like to talk about, which is the forms of grief. In my second chapter in The Anatomy of Grief, I write about the different forms that grief can take. And this is, I see grief like this, not in 5 stages, which don't work at all.
The Kubler-Ross thing doesn't work, the 5 stages?
Well, oh no. You know, where this came from with her was from her classic book that she wrote in 1969 on death and dying.
Right.
This is where stage theory and 5 stages came from. And what she did with this is explain, and she did a lot of research. It's a wonderful and classic book. These were the emotional changes that somebody who's terminally ill faces before they're about to die. Well, you can't deny that death has happened. This is one of the stages of dying. You can't really bargain for, as people who were terminally ill, as this is one of the stages, bargaining for their life. Well, you can't bargain that death doesn't happen because it did. And you can just go through all of these and they just don't make sense with grief. But it just came, it was in the American consciousness, well, since 1969 when she wrote that book. And it was as though it just naturally fell into thinking about grief, but it's become a pop culture idea, really. It simply doesn't work. And I can't say that strongly enough.
Interesting. I mean, because how can you bargain once you've already lost someone?
Right. Exactly. And, you know, I see, if I can, I think it might be helpful and interesting to talk about the forms of grief that I talk about in the book. I really list about, 16 or almost 20 of them.
Wow.
But I have to make clear, Joe, that these are not diagnostic disorders like in DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that the American Psychiatric Association publishes, and that one was 2013. No.
Right. And I am totally fine with that because I have we talked about words matter before.
Oh, absolutely.
I don't use the word disorder at all. Disorder separates people into a group that's ordered, a group that isn't. It's stigma. But tell us about these different types of grief that human beings can experience. These forms.
Well, and some of them you already know, the public already knows. Anticipatory grief. This is the grief that we experience when one is under the threat of death. A loved one is about to die or has a terminal illness or a kind of chronic, debilitating, finally terminal illness like Parkinson's. Well, you know, we've all felt this anticipatory grief during COVID. We've all, as a nation, felt that in the sense of how many more people are going to die. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, that death toll is going down. But that's one of the forms of grief, anticipatory, and many of my patients have experienced that.
Dorothy, let me just chime in there.
Sure.
The death toll is not going down. The rate is going down, but the death toll will never go down.
Well, true. That's true. That was a that word was wrong.
but I think that this is why your book is so important right now. Because we have a nation that is grieving.
Yes, absolutely.
And so tell me more.
Well, you know, just to pick up on that, I wrote an op-ed piece, February 22nd. It was published in The Hill, Washington, D.C. publication. Great. And it came out the afternoon of President Biden's second memorial, memorializing over 500 million people who had died of COVID. So, and in this, the name of it is it's the collective grief we must face. And
I think it's 500,000.
What did I say?
500 million. That would be.
You know, Joe, I have to tell you, my zeros have always been kind of mixed up.
That's all right. It's all right.
Thank you.
But go on.
Okay, so 500 million. What did I say again?
That's what you said. It's 500,000.
Say that again.
Okay. So why didn't I say 500,000?
Good. Well,
okay, thank you. Anyway, another form of grief is ambiguous grief. Pauline Boss.
Can we go back to the other one first?
Which one? Anticipatory?
Yeah. Is there a guilt component to that feeling, that emotion?
You know, there could be. Yeah. That's a wonderful question, Mark. And the guilt would be attached to, when a caretaker or relatives is taking care of somebody who is dying, and it goes on and on and on, and it can be really traumatic. And they feel, when is this going to be over? When are they going to die? And then they feel hideously, hideously guilty about thinking that. It's perfectly normal. There's exhaustion that you feel after you've been doing this over and over, taking care of the loved one. And some of the times, given whatever they have in terms of an illness, there can be EMTs coming to the house because there's a sense, okay, I think they're dying now, and they call 911, and it doesn't happen, and that can happen repeatedly. One of my patients had such a response to hearing sirens. It took a long time for after her husband died, because there were so many times that the EMTs came to the house and took him to the hospital. So yes, one can feel guilt about this. And it's important to understand, I think, for anyone who's grieving, that it's okay to have thought that. And another, actually this there's just so much to talk about. But one of the things that has been happening during COVID that I've been so strongly I respond to is what our frontline workers have been going through. I mean, they're the heroes in many ways of this COVID, this pandemic that we're living in and have lived through. But what they've gone through, being with patients who are dying and can't have their loved ones with them because of COVID, and COVID patients die alone, just maybe saying a virtual goodbye on an iPhone or an iPad. This is awful. And those doctors, nurses, other people, clinicians who are in the hospital, they've gone through this over and over and over. And they've experienced their own trauma. And a colleague of mine has written about this, along with colleagues of hers, calling this vicarious trauma. And I think that's a very, very apt term for what they're experiencing. And, you know, we hope that they've been able to debrief with coworkers on the unit, with friends, with family. And, you know, a lot of them could be helped by psychotherapy, but not everybody. It just depends how one deals with that kind of experience. Does that answer your question, Mark? I went way off.
No, absolutely. The whole guilt component was answered brilliantly. Dorothy, I think you gave a lot of people a sense of relief that it's perfectly normal to feel that way at the end of a long, long journey.
Yeah. You know, another form of grief that we've been all experiencing during COVID is ambiguous grief. I mean, how this was first come about as a term by Pauline Boss is this is experienced when a loved one goes missing and is considered dead, that they had died, they presumed dead. And there's no closure for us because there's no body to bury. Well, that's happened in many ways for a lot of people, not for everyone, but for a lot, because there hasn't been able to be traditional funerals. We haven't been able to come together in public to hold each other, to cry with each other, to just be with each other publicly to grieve. And also when you go to a wake or a sitting shiva or at a burial, there's a way to say goodbye. That's the last time on earth that you will be with the loved one, although now deceased. And it's an opportunity to say goodbye. We haven't been able to do that during COVID.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just been, you know, talk about words. You run out of words to be able to describe this, you know?
But it speaks, doesn't it, to this connection that we have with each other, and how each one of these examples you've given, it's really about how desperate human beings are, how critical connection is for us.
Oh yeah.
So how do those go together? Our need for connection, the loss of connection, and grief.
Well, in the traditional funeral services, you were connected. And that, you know, that begins for the newly bereaved, that begins their journey with grief. But they begin it with being attached, being connected to people, people who have come to the funeral home, to pay their respects, to say, I'm so sorry. However, when that ends, meaning the people that you're with during that first time and the after time or the after death time, that goes away. And that finally, that newly bereaved who becomes the bereaved, the griever, faces life alone. Yeah. And that's one of the ways also that is so different. Grief is so different than looking at it from 5 stages, because facing death is profoundly different than facing life without the loved one, for the bereaved. And that's part of that. I mean, how that unfolds itself depends on the griever, on the connections they have, the support they have, the family they have. It's, you know, the whole thing is just so individual. It's remarkable and wonderful, and yet you really can't put any kind of a template on it. And I think that's one of the important issues here. You can't squeeze it into a box or a formula. And you know, Joe, you mentioned a little while ago, how did you say it? Words? What were you saying about words? Because I wanted
words
to add.
Matter. Words matter.
Absolutely. And this is another point that I stress in the book is to talk about your grief, to be able to talk about it. Because talking about negative emotions changes processing in the brain. It goes from the feeling brain, the amygdala, up to the thinking brain, which is in the prefrontal cortex. And it doesn't stop the negative emotion, but with grief, it will help the person tolerate it a little better. And for anybody with negative emotions, I mean, there's been some very nice research showing this. So I'm a big proponent of words because that's what we do, right?
So I'm curious about this because now that you've brought in the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, which we talk about a lot. In the
do you?
Oh, yeah. We talk about these things a lot. I know that there are these different words that we use for the different types of grief, but what is the biology? Because that must be relatively universal. Do you talk about that, the biology of grief? What's actually happening in our bodies?
Well, it's a good question. And I think one of the forms of grief that is probably the most difficult form of grief, it's called complicated grief. And this is a very intense kind of grief that is actually relentless. The bereaved can't really let go of the intensity of what they're feeling. I'll get to the brain in a minute. The intensity of what they're feeling from the day the loved one died. Intrusive thoughts happen. They go back to mementos of the loved one, for example, photos of them, or a husband can't take his wife's clothes out of the closet. And there's a study that was done some years ago by Mary Frances O'Connor. It was an Fmri study that looked a study of complicated grief in women. There was a group of women with complicated grief. And
so let me just interrupt for a minute. So fMRI for our listeners.
Oh yes, sorry.
Magnetic resonance imaging. So we can actually take pictures of a brain as it's working and moving.
Right.
Go ahead.
And it's measure of blood flow, which is an indirect measure of neuronal activity. So this was an fMRI study of women with complicated grief. That was one group, and a group of women with non-complicated grief. Well, the women with complicated grief, when they were shown photos of their loved ones interspersed with photos, neutral ones, and the photos were paired with words from the individual women's descriptions of their loved one. So in other words, there was a loved one and a description that person used to say that these were some of the words that I can't remember exactly how it went, but anyway, let me get to the main point.
It's almost like they have like tag words.
Well, I think what they were doing is they did an interview with them and they took words from the interview. That's what they did.
Right, and how they would describe their loved one.
Exactly, exactly.
Got it.
So anyway, what happened with fMRI is that a part of the brain that's called the nucleus accumbens was activated in the women with complicated grief. And this is a part of the brain, as you know, Joe, that is involved with satisfaction, like when you're hungry, you eat, or when you are thirsty, you drink. But it's also the reward part of the brain. So what happens, we think, with women or anyone with complicated grief is there's such a satisfaction in going back to the memory, but the real distinct memory and mementos of the loved one, and with the intrusive thoughts that happen, that brain, part of the brain keeps getting activated. But that's one of the few studies that really looks at something it's not a one-to-one correspondence, obviously, but there's a very strong association with what the women were actually diagnosed with, because they do diagnose complicated grief. It's the only one that they do. And, I don't know if you know, Joe, but in this last DSM-5, they took it out in terms of a, quote, disorder, and as a condition to look at in the future.
Right.
complex bereavement.
Yeah, I mean, to say that somebody who's grieving is disordered is
I know.
never sat well.
Of course not.
But I think also the folks that I've worked with, sometimes they keep the clothes in the closet. They keep these things, and the complicated grief is just a way of not coming to terms with what has really happened.
Absolutely. They can't accept the death.
Right. So one of the things that I will say to folks is, if anybody tells you to get over it, just tell them to go to hell.
Yeah.
Tell them to go to hell, because you'll never get over it, but you must come to terms with it.
Right.
Because it is part of who you are.
Exactly. And what the relationship was like between you and the loved one who died.
So we've got a few minutes left. As people come to terms with grief,
yes,
what can they expect? How can they actually do this? I mean, we know that there's the grief of the loss of a loved one, and we could talk for a long time about whether it's a spouse, whether it's a sibling, whether, God forbid, it's a child.
right.
But how do we come to terms with these things?
Well, I think one of the most important ways of doing that is to, as I said before, and it sounds so easy, but of course it's not, to be able to accept the grief, not to be overwhelmed and frightened by what you're feeling, and to be able to, as I mentioned earlier, put your grief into words as much as you can. People don't really want to talk about grief, but given that we're in the pandemic and we've lived this way for a year, they're more likely to be able to listen. But this is one of the ways. And another way is, as I wrote in my op-ed piece, to do something that maybe, I call it art, but it can be anything. Journal writing, from journal writing, or just reading something and you write down a snippet of what you're reading and put it into a book. And to be able to realize that the more you think about and feel this grief, think about your loved one, the closer you're getting to basically memorializing them in your memory. And I talk about this as grief, as if you can think of it as lead, beginning to become burnished and turn into gold, into the joy of remembering your loved one with delight. I mean, it's bittersweet, of course, and there are tears, but you can cry grieving, but also smiling and remembering the loved one just in so many very different ways. And I don't know if I have time to go into it, but I did write about different kinds of tears. Do I have time?
Yeah, please. Please, we have a few minutes. Please, we'd love to hear it.
There are three kinds of tears. One is just the basic tears that we have, the basal tears that lubricate our eyes. And then another kind is reactive tears, when you're cutting up an onion or something and you begin to tear. But then there are emotional tears. And these are the tears that have one of the chemicals in these tears, the emotional tears, is leucine and enkephalin, which is related to endorphins. And this is what usually makes us feel better after we cry. And in the book, I put in images of from a book that was called The Topography of Tears by Lynn Fischer, which was an amazing book. It was just a book of photomicrographs. She took tears from different, and this was that she mentions strongly, this is not a study, evidence-based study by any means, but she would take tears from different emotions and put them on slides, cover slip them and put them under her microscope, and then take a photograph of it. And there were different patterns of tears for different emotions. And so I took some of them, like tears of grief or tears of letting go, or tears of attachment. It was really, her book is extraordinary, and so I illustrated some of what I was talking about in that particular chapter. And do I have time to just quickly talk about the book as a whole?
Sure, please.
Okay. Well, the book is divided into 3 different sections plus an epilogue. And the first section is Grief Described. And in that first chapter, I talk about the evolutionary origins of grief. And don't be surprised because I go back to the dinosaurs. Anybody who reads the book. Anyway, the second chapter is the forms of grief that we've been talking about. The third is the language of grief and how language for the newly bereaved changes. It's no longer, oh yes, you can call my husband da-da-da-da-da, or my brother is going to meet you at this restaurant, because the tense now is past tense. My brother,
interesting.
I can't meet you. And just the different words that are used, like widow or widower, or bereft. Language itself changes for the bereaved. And then the second part of the book is the physiology of grief, which is the grief-stricken brain, one chapter, the breaking heart, another chapter, and the body hurting, a third chapter. But this third section of the book is the lost loved ones, and I concentrate on the family, and each chapter is devoted, one is devoted to mother, another to father, to child, to sibling, I think I say brothers and sisters, and the last one to life's partner, spouse, a significant other. And the final, the epilogue, I call bittersweet alchemy. And I use that word that is another way of saying how crisis can create growth and change. Grief can alchemize into joy. Always, qualifying that with bittersweet. But you do begin to remember the loved one. Just chuckling sometimes and thinking, oh, I remember that. Or something you do, a song that you hear. Anyway, that's the book. And I
think how can people get the book?
Oh, well, it's everywhere right now. Any bookstore, Amazon. My website is dorothypholinger.com, and Holinger is with one L. Yale Press still has the book. Any number of bookstores, I think you can just look up the book. It's interesting enough, in Chicago, there's a bookstore called Seminary Co-op, and apparently it's the world's largest, as they say, bookstore of university press books. And they picked The Anatomy of Grief as one of their notable books.
That's great.
Yeah, it was
great.
Nice. And they did.
So, Doc, let me ask you, in the last couple of minutes, the IM, as you remember, we're all doing the best we can. And it's been interesting because we're talking about the 4 domains right here, the biological domain, the home, the social, and the IC. Because the domains interconnect, small changes have big effects. What small change can you recommend to our listeners in terms of grief?
Oh, in terms of grief?
Well, in general, what small change can you recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, what I was thinking about was to smile more, to be aware of trying to smile. That really does change how you're feeling. And another one, as you were talking about words, to be aware of your tone of voice with your words, because research has been done that if the tone of voice, the emotion that you're expressing, doesn't match the words that you're saying, people listen to the tone of voice, to the emotion.
So true. The other rule, you control no one, you influence everyone. Dr. Holinger, what kind of influence are you hoping to be?
Well, I do hope the book will have an influence on many, many people. I hope it will help them and help them understand how they don't have to be afraid of grief. Grief is the price we pay for love. It's the other side of love. It's as intense as the love you had for that that person who died.
That is the most important lesson. You grieve in proportion to love.
Yeah, beautifully
Folks,
put. Yeah, absolutely.
thank you so much for being here tonight. Everybody, we'll see you next week in the Dr. Joe Show. Thank Dorothy.
Oh, you're welcome.